I boasted that I had trapped him, and now I was trapped in a life I hated. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so suffocating. When I first set my sights on Daniel, I thought I was being clever, strategic even. He was the golden ticket, charming, successful, the kind of man other women whispered about with envy. And I was the one who won. I played my cards right, made myself irresistible, and when he finally proposed, I smugly told my closest friends, "See? I told you I could trap him." But here I was, years later, pacing the cold floors of our oversized home, feeling more like a prisoner than a victor. It started with the small things. The way he'd come home later and later, claiming work had been relentless. The way his touch, once possessive and urgent, turned absent-minded and perfunctory. At first, I ignored it, convincing myself that marriage always cooled with time. Then I started noticing his phone. Always face down, always buzzing with messages he never answered in front of me. A locked screen when it never had a password before. A name, JS, that appeared more often than I cared to admit. Then, last week, I found the receipt. A dinner at La Rue, the kind of place we used to go to when we were still pretending we were in love. But I wasn't there that night. I had been home, alone, believing his lie about a late meeting. The receipt sat on the dresser for exactly 2 days before I picked it up and held it between my fingers like it was radioactive. It was a single moment of undeniable proof. I had imagined betrayals before, conjured them in my head like cruel fantasies. But this was real. And yet, I waited. I told myself I needed more. I needed to be sure. Because if I confronted him and I was wrong, what then? What if I had misread all of it? The texts, the distance, the whispers on his lips that no longer reached my ears? So, I waited. And I set my own trap. I spent the next week pretending. Smiling when he walked through the door. Kissing him goodnight. Asking about his day as if I actually cared. I even initiated sex once, just to see if he would refuse me. He didn't, but he might as well have. His hands felt like a stranger's, going through the motions, careful, detached. I wanted to slap him, scream at him, demand that he look me in the eye and see what he was doing to me. But I didn't. Because I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed proof. Something undeniable. Something I could throw in his face when I ripped his world apart. I started watching him more closely, studying his movements the way a hunter studies its prey. I noticed how his fingers twitched when his phone buzzed. How he took his calls outside, in the garage, his voice low, careful. How his excuses were getting lazy. Late meeting, last-minute work dinner, just grabbing a drink with the guys. Lies, every single one. I started following him. The first night, he actually was at the office, which almost made me doubt myself. Almost. But 2 nights later, he drove right past it. Instead, he went to a sleek, glass-walled high-rise in the city, the kind with concierge service and private elevators. I parked across the street and watched as he strode inside with the ease of familiarity. Like he'd done this before. I sat there for an hour, my heart a fist in my chest. When he finally emerged, he wasn't alone. She was tall, effortlessly elegant, the kind of woman who didn't need to try. A black dress hugged her body, her manicured fingers brushing against his wrist as they stepped onto the sidewalk. She laughed, tilted her head back, exposing a long, delicate neck, before she leaned in, whispering something in his ear. "And Daniel?" He smiled. Not the forced, polite smile he gave me at home. Not the tired, distracted one he wore at the end of the day. No. This was real. Genuine. Like she was the one thing in his life that made him feel alive. I felt something snap inside me. I should have stormed over, screamed his name, made a scene. But I didn't. Because I was done being impulsive. I had trapped him once before. Now, I was going to do it again. But this time, he wouldn't see it coming. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of them together like a broken reel in my head. The way his body leaned into hers. The way she touched his wrist, possessive, like he already belonged to her. The way he smiled. That was the worst part. I had spent years believing that Daniel had simply settled into the dull routine of marriage. That his detachment was the natural erosion of time. But no, he still had passion. It just wasn't for me. I was done waiting. I needed a plan. Something ruthless. Something he wouldn't recover from. A man like Daniel, a man who believed himself untouchable, would never see me coming. He thought I was oblivious. That was my greatest weapon. The next morning, I played the role of the doting wife perfectly. Made him coffee, kissed his cheek before he left for work, texted him something playful in the afternoon. I even suggested a date night. He looked surprised but pleased, probably thinking I was growing desperate to keep him. Good. Let him think that. I had no name, but I had a location. That building, the sleek high-rise where Daniel had disappeared for an hour, was my starting point. I dressed carefully before heading there. Not in the soft neutrals I usually wore, but in something sharper. Black heels, a sleek dress, the kind of confidence that made people answer questions before they even knew why they were talking. The concierge was easy to manipulate. A well-placed smile, a feigned moment of confusion about forgetting which unit belonged to my dear friend. I caught a glimpse of the digital log when he glanced at the screen. JS, Unit 14B. JS. The name that had been appearing in his messages. I rode the elevator up, rehearsing the way I would introduce myself. Would I play the clueless wife? The vengeful storm? When the door opened, I was met with something I didn't expect. She wasn't just anyone. I knew her. Julia Stanton. My former best friend. I stood there, rooted in place, as she stared at me, her lips parting in shock. Hannah, she breathed. The betrayal burned deeper. This wasn't just some random woman. This was her. The person who had once promised me loyalty, who had wiped my tears through past heartbreaks. And now she was sleeping with my husband. I smiled. It wasn't real, but she didn't know that yet. Julia, I said sweetly, stepping inside before she could slam the door. We need to talk. She hesitated, then nodded. I was going to tell you, she started. I laughed at that. Sure you were. She had the decency to look ashamed. It just happened. Of course. That's what they always say. I let her talk, nodding along as if I was heartbroken and fragile. Let her believe she was in control of this conversation. Let her think I was just another scorned wife, hurt but ultimately powerless. Then I leaned in and whispered, "You're going to help me destroy him." Her eyes widened. What? I tilted my head, letting my voice drop to something colder. You don't think he loves you, do you? You were convenient. Do you know how many times he's done this before? I saw the flicker of doubt in her expression. She wanted to believe she was special. That she was different from the others. That she was the one. I can prove it, I continued. But I need your help. She hesitated. Help with what? I smiled, slow and deliberate. Trapping him. I had everything I needed. A cheating husband. A weak mistress. And a plan that would leave Daniel with nothing. Now, all that was left was execution. Julia stared at me, her perfectly lined lips slightly parted, her breath uneven. She wasn't used to being on this side of the betrayal. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the war between self-preservation and guilt. What do you mean, trap him? She asked, her voice just above a whisper. I took my time answering, walking through her apartment like I belonged there. A glass of wine sat half-finished on the marble countertop. The couch had an indentation, Daniel's spot, probably. The scent of his cologne still lingered in the air. I turned back to Julia, my smile razor sharp. I mean, we ruin him, I said. Publicly. Completely. And in a way that he never sees coming. She swallowed hard. Hannah, I don't know. I tilted my head. Julia, do you really think he was going to leave me for you? She flinched. I leaned in, letting my voice drop to something almost gentle. You're his affair, not his future. I've seen this before. He's a collector, he likes the chase. The second things get complicated, he moves on. She exhaled shakily, and I knew I had her. Because deep down, she already knew it was true. I poured myself a glass of her wine, taking a slow sip before delivering the final blow. And he's already seeing someone else. Her face crumbled. You're lying. I shrugged. Maybe. But are you willing to risk it? She didn't answer. That's when I knew she was mine. I didn't need her to be smart. I needed her to be emotional. I needed her to feel like I was the only one who understood her, like we were on the same side. So, I fed her little details. Let her believe she was uncovering Daniel's betrayals with me, not because of me. I had already found suspicious receipts, ones that weren't tied to Julia's apartment. Reservations for dinners that had never happened. A jewelry purchase I had certainly never received. With every new revelation, Julia unraveled. It was almost too easy. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, texts, emails, financial records. I even managed to clone his phone for a brief window, long enough to retrieve months' worth of deleted messages. But I needed something bigger. So, I created a new betrayal. A carefully crafted, undeniable proof that Daniel was orchestrating an elaborate web of lies. A bank transaction for a down payment on a luxury condo, one that Julia would believe was meant for another woman. A message from an unknown number, confirming a weekend getaway that didn't exist. It was all fake, of course. But Julia didn't need to know that. She just needed to believe it. Destruction was only satisfying if it was witnessed. I needed Daniel to fall apart in real time, in front of the people who admired him most. His colleagues. His friends. His family. His company's annual gala was in 3 days. A black tie event filled with powerful executives, investors, and media connections. The perfect stage. I arranged for Julia to be there, armed with all the evidence she thought she had gathered. A series of emails scheduled to be sent at exactly 9:45 p.m., to Daniel's boss, his closest friends, his parents, and most importantly, me. A digital bomb, detonating in perfect sync. And for the grand finale? A perfectly edited video compilation. Messages, bank statements, recorded phone calls. A montage of Daniel's infidelity projected onto a massive screen for all to see. I would act devastated, of course. Play the grieving wife, the betrayed woman. Julia would be a wild card, hurt, angry, unpredictable. The guests would eat it up. And Daniel? He'd have nowhere to hide. I had already emptied half of our joint accounts into a separate fund weeks ago. Our house, technically, my house, thanks to a legal clause he never cared to read, was already listed under my name alone. His car? Leased under my credit. His business connections? Built through my networking. He would lose everything. By the time the night was over, he'd be humiliated, financially crippled, and socially exiled. And I'd walk away clean. Not as the scorned wife. Not as the fool. But as the woman who played the long game, and won. I stood at the entrance of the gala, watching the guests arrive in glittering gowns and pressed tuxedos. Julia was already inside, sipping champagne, her eyes scanning the room for Daniel. The countdown had begun. I adjusted the strap of my dress, exhaled slowly, and stepped into the lion's den. The trap was set. And soon, Daniel would realize. He wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. I moved through the gala like a ghost, unseen but everywhere. Daniel was in his element, laughing with colleagues, his hand resting lightly on the small of Julia's back. He had no idea she knew. No idea what was coming. He thought he had it all, his wife safely oblivious, his mistress wrapped around his finger, his career flourishing. Arrogant. Predictable. The best part? He had no idea I was the one controlling the game. I slipped my phone from my clutch, heart steady, fingers poised over the screen. With one tap, the scheduled emails would send. One tap, and Daniel's empire would begin to crumble. I took a deep breath, watching as he leaned in to whisper something into Julia's ear. She smiled, but it was tight. Forced. Perfect. I tapped the screen. Across the room, Julia's phone buzzed. Then Daniel's. Then the CEO's. Then the investors. The first ripple of confusion spread across the floor as people pulled out their devices. Murmurs grew, gasps followed. I could see it in real time, the realization, the horror, the sharp glances in Daniel's direction. He frowned at his phone. Read. Stiffened. Then, Julia turned to him, her expression a mask of controlled fury. She lifted her glass, too fast, too forceful, and the champagne sloshed over the rim, splashing onto his crisp white shirt. Oops, she said, her voice laced with venom. Silence fell over the nearby crowd. Daniel barely reacted. He was still reading. Still processing the digital onslaught. His lips parted slightly as he scrolled through the messages, the fake bank transaction, the weekend getaway receipts, the affectionate texts from an unknown number. I saw the moment he realized. The moment it clicked that this wasn't just a leak. It was a setup. His head snapped up, searching the room. Searching for me. I stepped into the light. Daniel? Julia's voice was dripping with sugar-coated steel. His gaze flicked to her, but his entire body was rigid. Julia, I. Slap. The sound cracked through the ballroom, sharp as a gunshot. A few guests gasped. Others barely concealed their delight. I had underestimated how much Julia wanted revenge. You bastard, she hissed, stepping closer, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. How long has it been? Huh? Was I just another notch on your belt? Julia, stop. I'm not done. She lifted her phone, shaking it in his face. I just got a lovely email full of evidence about your little, extracurricular activities. Tell me, Daniel, how many women were there? He swallowed hard, eyes darting around, but there was no escape. Too many people watching. No way to contain it. You manipulative piece of. Another slap. This one sent his phone clattering to the marble floor. The room erupted. I caught the CEO exchanging glances with another executive. Investors whispered behind raised hands. His colleagues, his so-called friends, were either watching with undisguised glee or shaking their heads in disappointment. I walked toward him, slow and deliberate, heels clicking against the floor. He turned to me, his face pale, his jaw tight. Hannah. I tilted my head, a slow smile curving my lips. Oh, don't stop on my account, sweetheart. His nostrils flared. You did this. The accusation in his voice almost made me laugh. I leaned in slightly, close enough that only he could hear me. You did this to yourself. His entire body tensed. You set me up. I arched a brow. You made it easy. Then, as if the night hadn't already reached its peak, the final act began. A massive projector screen flickered to life at the far end of the ballroom. I turned my head just in time to see the first image. Daniel. In a hotel room. Shirt half unbuttoned. Julia stepping out of the bathroom, wrapped in nothing but a towel. The next shot, Daniel kissing her neck. His hands gripping her waist. And then, the damning messages, blown up for everyone to see. I feigned shock, placing a hand over my mouth as a collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone from HR rushed forward, fumbling to shut it off, but the damage was already done. Daniel lunged toward the AV table. Turn it off. Too late. He was finished. I turned back to him, tilting my head. That's quite a show, Daniel. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. And then, in a voice so low I almost missed it, he said, "You were never the victim, were you?" I let the mask slip for just a second. Just long enough for him to see the truth. "No," I murmured. "I was the executioner." Security approached, speaking in hushed voices with the CEO. Julia stormed out, throwing one final glare over her shoulder. Daniel? He just stood there. Ruined. The guests began to disperse, whispering, shaking their heads. He wouldn't recover from this. Not socially. Not professionally. His reputation, his career, his relationships, gone. And as I turned to leave, stepping over his shattered pride, I whispered one last thing for him to hear. Checkmate. The divorce was swift. I had planned too well, moved my money too early. He had nothing to fight with. Julia disappeared from his life. The company severed ties. As for me, I thrived. I wasn't the woman who lost her husband. I was the woman who won the war. And I never let anyone trap me again.